ComBappers, lurkers, and everybody say hi to Dave and Maria over there. I always get
Hi
it
there.
wrong. Over there. I
Can
can't.
you hear Maria okay?
Can I hear Maria? Okay. Oh,
Hi.
I'm pointing, but no one can see me because I forgot to take the verse off. Okay, there I am. There. Hi. Who cares about me? But there's Dave and Maria.
Hi.
They're sitting on the wonderful beach in Sylvan Lake. Look at that nice day you guys have. We got garbage other than the horrible T-shirt that Dave's wearing. It looks like a nice day.
Sec. Keys are on my way.
Oh, he's got to get his keys out. All right. So,
Okay.
hey, before we start, we always start with a Bible verse. So you got a Bible verse first, Dave, and you said it was James 4:6.
Verse 6, and it's a reminder to me, especially in times like this, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
Yeah. But he gives us more grace. That's why scriptures say God opposes the proud, but shows favors to the humble. Favor to the humble. That's a good verse, a good reminder to us in these days that grace is super important. All right, so hey, full disclosure, Maria is my sister, and that makes Dave my brother-in-law. And Maria's been my sister since 19. Oh my goodness, you were born in 73, and then adopted in.
January of 1974.
Okay, so basically, yeah, you were very little when you joined us, and you ended up staying with us. Now you're both technically 60s scoop people, right?
Yes.
Yeah, even though it was the 70s. Well, David was the 60s because Dave's really old. But he's also got a lot of hair, so that makes up.
I was at 8 months old. I was a foster child, and at 2 years, I was finally adopted. But I was in the McMann home since I was probably about one-ish.
Right. Now, so you both are sort of similar in that regard. You're very young in a different family, but with all the stuff that's going on these days with riots and political stuff and all this talk about racism, I thought it would be really appropriate to talk about some of your guys' experiences, because in a sense they're very similar, but in a sense they're also kind of different. So, Dave, you grew up in Alberta. Maria grew up in British Columbia.
Right.
And
my ancestry's Yukon.
Yeah, you're from the Yukon, and Maria's from close to the Yukon up in northern British Columbia.
Yeah.
So you're almost neighbors in that sense, but
yeah.
Maria, you as far as experiencing racism firsthand, you didn't have a whole lot when you were little. Can you tell us that story?
Well, when I was born in on my reserve, which is north of Fort St. John.
Right.
Halfway River First Nation, and then I was taken off the reserve a few days later. My family was not healthy enough to take care of me, so my one aunt who was young, she called actually the taxi cab at Fort St. John to come pick me up. And when he came to get me, I was actually so small I was fit in a shoebox. Wow. So he got me to Fort St. John. Back then the roads were not paved, it was gravel road, so he was worried that I was not going to make it, but I did.
It was just you and the taxi driver alone, right? There was no one else in the car.
Yeah. Right. No. Then I got to the hospital, and then of course social services kicked in, and then ended up in the Hogan family when I was 2.5 months old. Of course, mom and dad, they were working there in Fort St. John, and they found that because there's multiple reserves around there, so there's a lot of First Nations people, but then also the white people, and so they noticed that there was racism going on, so they didn't want to raise me in that situation. And also, with my biological family being so close. So when I was about 4 years old, we moved to Langley. My dad got a transfer with the BC government, so I grew up mostly in the lower mainland of BC, and it's very multicultural there. So a lot of like East Indians and Hindus and Chinese and yeah, so it was multicultural. So I didn't really experience much there at all.
Much negativity, that is.
Yeah.
So you were actually only 4. I thought you were older than that. So that's an insight, because I was in grade 8. What does that make me? 14, something like that. What's 8 plus
It was
6?
it was 78 when we moved down.
Yeah, I was in
So
grade
I was
8.
just entering kindergarten at that time.
But yeah, so you actually never even went to school in Fort St. John.
No.
I didn't even fathom that. But so all your schooling was in Langley and Abbotsford. Okay.
Yes, and Kamloops.
In Kamloops. So even growing up, like, when was the first time you sort of felt like someone actually treated you racistly?
Uh, I don't know. Like, I didn't really pay attention to that. Like, I just was part of the family and whatnot. I
Mm-hmm.
think the first time I really noticed was when we were living in Abbotsford. We went to some, I think, skating rink or something, roller rink, and we're standing in line, and someone had said something to me, but I didn't really hear it. But Jim, our brother, did hear it, and actually Jim went and punched the guy out and told him never say anything to his sister ever again,
Wow.
or else it's going to be worse.
Yeah.
But yeah, otherwise, no, I didn't really experience anything in the Lower Mainland. The first time I really had anything said to me to my face was in junior high in Kamloops.
Okay.
Kamloops has a big band, First Nations band there, and so there's a lot of mixture there, mostly First Nations and white people. But I was going to junior high school with my two cousins, Hogan cousins, who are white, and one guy did come up to me and say something. So I actually slammed him against the wall, the lockers, and told him never to say that again, or else it's gonna be worse next time. And the guy left me alone, and he never said anything else. And I had nothing else said to me or bothered me or anything. I had quite a few friends that were white, but a lot of friends also First Nations there in Kamloops. So
Yeah.
it was, yeah, that was only really 2 times I experienced anything really like that. So
Right. And now, okay, so we'll switch over to Dave now. Dave, your experiences growing up were quite a bit, well,
Well, a little bit more different.
no, I would say different, yeah.
I didn't have the supports when I was adopted in the McMann family.
Mm-hmm.
The youngest one to me was 18 years older, so he had just left the house, and so I came along. And my parents had 7 kids before me. And anyway, so I grew up on a farm in eastern Alberta. The closest reserve to me at that time was probably Onion Lake Reserve,
Mm-hmm.
out by Lloydminster. I was about 60 miles away. So I guess I was the only native in a 60-mile radius around that area. So I didn't really start experiencing things probably till about grade 2 or 3 in school. It was about then that everything started kind of going downhill.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, I used to deal with, you know, always trying, but there's always people putting you down. They wanted to play back then. There's was westerns on TV, and I was always kind of ashamed of being darker skinned. I didn't know what it was, but I was ashamed of being dark skinned because I'd watched John Wayne movies or whatever, and First Nations getting shot and falling off horses and things like that. And so I had that kind of in the back of my head, but I didn't want to admit it that I was First Nation.
Okay.
And then when I got to about grade 3, the experience became a little bit tougher, and I always remember the start of it. I was standing on a hill. You know how you stand on a hill and you start playing, King of the Castle.
Yeah.
And I'm there, and all of a sudden, 4 or 5 guys grab me and throw me off and say, you Indian people aren't allowed up here. Throws me off. And then they that's when it started, and then it became like a hobby to them. Every week, on average, I would get into a scuffle. Grade 5 was probably the worst. I'd have 6 guys hold me, and 2 guys would kick me and punch me, and then throw me on the ground and jump off different objects to land on me, kind of like Jimmy Snuka, but they use their knees and their other body parts.
World Wrestling Federation. Yeah, it does not. So
guys would hold me, and I ended up with 5 vertebrae out of place, 2 cracked ribs.
So during this time, are they still calling you names and stuff, or is it just their?
Yeah, they did. They called me names, and then they would keep, like about grade 9, finally, I was about 14, and
Mm.
we had shop, and so there's two towns, Chauvin and Edgerton, where we go to have shop. Well, then the other school kids wanted to take part of it.
Mm.
So at one point there I had 15 to 16 people giving me kicks and boots and beating me up.
What,
And then
at one time?
at one time, and then they would wait for the teacher to come in the hallway, and then 4 guys would hold me up, and the other guys would circle me so the teacher couldn't see I was there. And then
Wow.
as soon as the teacher went back down the hallway, then they'd start putting the boots and stuff to me. And I went home, and I was getting tired of being a human pinata.
Mm.
That I finally, I was told my mom, well, I didn't tell her, but I was going to take some pills, and I was 14, and I was going to end it all,
Wow.
because I said it was from grade 3 to grade 9, it was like that. And I didn't understand why the hatred was so much, or why there was racism.
Mm-hmm.
But it became like a sport because I was different than anybody else, my skin color. And so I thought, well, the best way to kind of combat it is to be good at something. And so that's when I would start practicing. I realized I couldn't play hockey. I was an okay hockey player, but I wasn't big enough. But I figured I could play baseball, and that's when I started working at that, and I became okay. And from Chauvin, Provost area, they've won a few national championships,
Yeah.
and things across Canada. And so I was an okay ball player there. And then I moved to a place called Breton, or Alsike, Alberta, in about grade 10. And that's when things turned around, because I then wasn't the darkest person around anymore. In Breton, there was a larger population of African Canadians there, and everybody seemed to accept them. And
So it's not that they just weren't picking on anybody.
they just weren't picking on anybody, really. They were
Okay.
a little bit, but nothing like to the point that I'd had in Eastern Alberta.
Right. So
Uh,
if you wouldn't have been, if you hadn't looked native when you were living up in the other place, do you think you would have been beat up?
I don't think so.
Okay. So
Because
it was pretty much straight up racism.
Yeah, and where I was at,
Right.
and I mean, even driving down the street, we drive to Lloydminster, and this is younger days, but people would yell out their windows at the First Nations on the side of the road on walking down the Lloydminster streets, and I'd be a little bit aware of it, and then of course I'd kind of duck in the truck or whatever, just try to stay away from anybody really seeing me, because one, I was embarrassed because of what I was and who I was, but also my I always, it even affects me now, all these years later,
Mm-hmm.
the fear factor of, if I hear a noise of tires squealing sometimes. I mean, I've had times when I've walked down the street and I've had milkshakes and pops thrown at me, from their vehicles, and calling names out the windows and
What town is
things.
that? What town was that in?
That was in I can't remember which town. I think it was up around. There's sometimes like around in BC. I've had that. And when I went out to Toronto, I went out there when I was doing work with the NHLPA.
Mm-hmm.
I did work out there, and people. I was walking down the street, and somebody threw a milkshake at me because I was a First Nations in a suit. They didn't like it, I guess. And so that was just, you deal with different types of things.
And how old were you then? You were in your 20s.
I was in my 20s, I guess.
Yeah.
But how old were you in 96? Yeah, 25. So I'm still 25. So, but yeah, it's just those things that you deal with, and even when the times, like, things that fear set in, was like when after I met Maria and I got in with your family. My biggest fear is I don't want my kids to ever experience the things that I experienced.
Right.
And so we moved up to Fort St. John, and Teddy, that's when he first experienced a little bit of racism.
Right.
And that was one of the reasons why we came back, was because in my head, because I didn't want him or the girls to experience any of that. Then when we had, we came to Swift Current that one time, and my one manager there, she called me a few names and behind the scenes, and kind of did threats to me, and I had that feeling again and not wanting to be there.
Yeah.
And so that was the thing that made me, for that short time, move, because I had that cold flesh and I didn't know how to handle it.
Right.
I didn't know how to address it because, I mean, one, I'm in your family and who I'm representing, but also, am I being, just like I said with my verse, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. And I'd sort of try to live by grace more than having to be chastened by God and then being chastened by people. And that was the hardest thing. So I dealt with a lot of that growing up.
Okay, well, we're gonna pause this. We're gonna do 2 episodes because we haven't got to even modern day. That's why when Dave starts talking, yeah. When did we have you preach here one Sunday in Swift Current? I think we did.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
It was only
Yeah,
at 6. I hung around Pentecostal churches. I figured they go for 7 hours.
All right, so we're gonna stop the live stream today. We'll record the next session and we'll put it up tomorrow. So that's part 1. So all right, Dave and Maria, say bye to everybody, and we'll say hi to in a minute. All right, thanks. We'll talk to you guys. Well, I'll be talking to you in a second, but everybody else will be seeing this conversation tomorrow. All right.
Take care.
Okay, I've ended that.